This is Anti-Social Studies AP European History Edition. I'm Emily Poole, and let's get started with Unit 1. Unit 1 in AP Euro is Renaissance and Exploration. And my guiding question for you over the course of your study in this unit is, how did the revival of trade culturally, economically, and politically impact Europe? We're using those themes that I've been talking about already, and we're also focusing on a specific historical thinking skill, which is causation. Now, let me give you some contextualization before we start. Hopefully you watched that last intro video, but if you haven't, just a reminder, Europe was in its dark ages after the fall of Rome. They were broken up into these feudal states. There was a loss of learning, there was a loss of trade, there was a loss of really innovation and kind of technological advancement. And in 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, and these series of crusades that occurred over the course of the next couple of centuries really started to initiate trade and open Europe back up to the rest of the world. So they were no longer cut off from trade, but now were exposed to Silk Roads, Trans-Saharan Indian Ocean trade, and got access to technology that they hadn't had access to. Now, most of these other continents, Africa and Asia, were in their golden ages and had an influx of incredible technology that Europe is now gaining for the first time. And in the Islamic world specifically, there were these things called madrasas, which are universities. Now, these universities, Muslim scholars had actually preserved Greek and Roman texts that these Europeans now are bringing back with them to Europe and now have access to. The beautiful golden ages of Greece and Rome. So Europe moves from its dark ages to its early golden age as a result of the Crusades, because the Crusades are opening Europe back up to the rest of the world. Now, that's going to be what starts this Renaissance, or the Renaissance, if you will. And that Renaissance is going to start with art in Italy. I'm going to give you now a general overview of what happened after the Renaissance. I'm not going to get into specifics about the art, but I will do a video on that in just a little bit, so get excited for it. But there are three things, right, if I'm going back to that guiding question, that I want to focus in on. How did this revival of trade from the Crusades culturally, economically, and politically impact Europe? Culturally first, there's this start of secular humanism. So secular means worldly, it's the opposite of religious, and humanism is the focus on human potential and human achievement. The Middle Ages was dominated by the Catholic Church. It's sometimes called the Age of Faith. And now with this access to the rest of the world and access to a lot of new literature and new technology, people start focusing less on the church and on Christianity and more on themselves and the here and now. Less on the afterlife, more on the here and now. And we see that play out in a lot of different ways in Europe. Culturally, we see it impact art. We see this harkening back to the classics of Greece and Rome. I have a picture of Raphael's School of Athens here. Northern Renaissance picture, again, that's focused really just on humans doing regular things. That's Peter Bruegel's The Harvesters. And then Brunelleschi's Dome is that bottom right photo. Again, it's the fact that Europeans have now gotten technology that they didn't have access to before is going to allow them to build things like this beautiful dome, which is still in Florence today. And then, of course, in the 1440s, Johann Gutenberg makes his printing press, which is going to facilitate the spread of education and literature and literacy all across Europe, but I'll talk about that more in our next unit. So we see that this revival of trade is starting to culturally impact Europe because Europeans are going to be focusing less on the afterlife or on Christianity and focusing more on themselves and the here and now. So it's a huge cultural change that is happening as a result of this revival of trade. Economically, this is pretty straightforward. It increases economics in Europe. Europeans start to make a lot more money than they used to because now they're hooked up to all these trade routes. Also, Columbus is like, hey, you know what I want to do? Get more involved with the Indian Ocean trade because that's where all the spices are and that's where all the wealth is, and I'm tired of going overland to get there. So then he sets sail to try to find India, but ends up landing in the Caribbean. So that, of course, is going to economically impact Europe because the Europeans discovered new continents on the other side of the world, which then they plunder, and we'll talk about that later. But economically, Europe, again, is brought out of its dark ages. It's starting to make a lot more money. It's starting to control trade. And with that, actually, you see a balance of power shift from the Mediterranean region to the Atlantic region. Italy was controlling a lot of the trade after the Crusades, really up until 1492 in that Mediterranean area. But now, with the discovery of the Americas, the balance of power is going to shift from that Mediterranean region into the Atlantic region, specifically focusing on Spain, Portugal, France, and England. And this new wealth is obviously going to impact politics. These new monarchs are like, hey, wow, we have so much more money than we used to. What are we going to do with it? Build a military to protect our power. That's one of the things. And also, you have new political thinkers like Machiavelli, who's this bottom left photo here, start to write about the purpose of politics. How should a king act? Why should a king act that way? And there are some other people like Desiderius Erasmus who also write about politics in a very different way. That could be a good comparison. I can talk about that more next time. So for foreshadowing, moving on from this unit, all of this new learning, this revival of trade, this change in culture, this change in economics, this change in political structures, how is that going to continue to impact the balance of power in Europe? Talked about how politically and economically things are shifting from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. That's not the only thing that's going to be changing as a result of this revival of trade. Who or what will gain power, and who or what will continue to lose power? We'll find out more next time. But in the meantime, like and subscribe, follow along. Thanks, y'all.